in this course, we're going to be looking at service accounts and in specific Google Cloud Service accounts and what they are. And we're going to be looking at how they compare to regular user accounts, right? So this course actually sits at a level 100. So we're going to be really doing a high level overview on what service accounts are. So let's start off by visually looking at an illustration of what service accounts is. So before we get to service accounts, let's take a step back here, right? So let's look at an example here. So we have our user, and our users are typically connecting to applications, right? So this is a normal scenario. And in this, we actually see there is user involvement, and users typically enter some kind of credential like a username and password, and then have access to the application. There may be some authorization happening depending on the scope of what the permissions allows, the extent of what the application can be accessed, right? Now, another scenario is instead of the user, what happens if we have an application, like for example, a batch job processes, agents, and your regular application that actually wants to connect to applications, right? So in this scenario, there is no human user representation, right? So it's really app to app connections with no end user involvement. And it is this later example is exactly where service accounts come into play, right? So usually user accounts are in the top half where users using applications or connecting to applications, and the bottom part is when we have applications to application scenarios, and that's where service accounts come into play, right? So let's actually do a little bit more deeper dive on user accounts versus service accounts, right? So both of them actually are a resource. So for example, it is accessed by other accounts like users and groups, right? And both of them are also a principle in that it's giving access to something, a resource. So for example, user accounts give access to an application, and also a service account also gives access to an application or something. The only difference is what is the source, right? So they are both resources and they're both principles, right? Now, where things begin to deviate is passwords, right? So user accounts are typically passwords. The user will enter a password at some kind of prompt browser or something. But because service accounts don't actually involve humans, that step doesn't actually exist. So we have to find out a mechanism which is more automated and something like an application a service account could use, right? And again, if we look in the user world here, there is, browser-based sign-in can be used, but it can't be used with service accounts. And also another key difference where we begin to move away from user accounts is when it's created and managed as a resource, it is attached to actually a GCP project, right? We are attaching it to it. Unlike user accounts, they don't actually necessarily need to be done as a resource that is attached to a GCP project, right? Now, user accounts are managed inside Cloud Identity or Google Workspace accounts. And really, Cloud Identity is that repository of all those users. So by definition, because they're users, they do sit in Cloud Identity, and because service accounts are not users, they don't actually sit inside Cloud Identity, right? Now, they are, if you think about it, um, user accounts are technically not specific to Google Cloud, right? So if you think about it, a user account could exist on-prem using Active Directory, right? Or it can be used in a different environment like AWS or Azure, and then those user accounts could be federated, synced, into Google Cloud. So the origin of those user accounts don't actually have to um, exist actually inside GCP, right? Um, but for service accounts, they do need to actually be specific to Google Cloud. Service accounts is not something you create on-prem and then you sync it to GCP, or it's not something you have in AWS and then you move it into Google Cloud, right? You may have service accounts in Azure and AWS, but you're not bringing those service accounts into Google. And that's an important characteristic here of service accounts, right? Now, another key element here is users are managed in Google's cloud identity, which makes sense because cloud identity is that repository of all your users, right? And is actually the workload is across a lot of different products and services. So that user account is kind of mapping to different products, services, giving you access, etc. But by definition, service accounts are not user orientated or user bound, right? So therefore, it shouldn't actually exist in cloud identity. Another big difference here. So now, so far, we've really been talking at a high level here. Let's just go specifically around authentication, right? How is authentication done? So we really mentioned before that we're not really using password when it comes to service accounts. So what is exactly we're doing here, right? So with authentication, we use accounts, it uses passwords, but service accounts don't. And with that, you do actually get single sign-on. So you got single sign-on, signing, that kind of world exists in the user accounts. It doesn't actually exist in service accounts, and there are different ways of doing that, which we're going to explore in some of the later slides. Right now, there are some major security issues with using service accounts. So from a security perspective, is not really, we're saying that hey, this is the golden bullet, right, as to the evolution of how we're moving away from user accounts to service account. It represents a different use case, and along with that does pose some risks associated with it. So let's look at something here. So one of the most common security issues with using service accounts is privilege escalations, right? You don't want to give someone some level of privilege and they're able to get more. Like for example, you give perhaps read and now they're getting read write, or perhaps you're giving them read write or read and then move to admin level, right? So that's a privilege escalation, and it could exist with service accounts. You give them access to a specific component originally, and then somehow that privilege is then escalated further. Now, another security issue is spoofing. So service accounts could perhaps potentially be spoofed, right? So it could be masqueraded, or it could take on um, another genuine connection here, right? And non-reputation is a risk with service accounts. It does exist, right? So what we mean by this is, how do you actually validate that the actual service account that was intended to make the connection did actually make the connection, and it wasn't another service account, right? And another key element here is, if we look at it before on that original slide at the beginning, service accounts is all about application to application. It's all automatic, right? So there could be this issue that service accounts could expose more information than it should do. So when it's connecting to an application, it's getting access to more information, it's disclosing more information that was originally intended. So that is a big concern with security issues here with service accounts, right? Now, service accounts do actually have a dual use. So what do I actually mean by this, right? So what I mean by this is that, service accounts does two things here, two main things. So let's dive deep into what those two things are, right? So first of all, as you remember from the previous slides, right, service accounts are principals, right? So by definition, we need to limit the privileges and reduce the blast radius, right? It is accessing something, right? So we don't want it to go on and access other things. So if you give permissions to, say, let's say, service accounts to access application ABC, we don't want that service account then to access application XYZ, right? So let's limit the privileges to what it can do, and also inside the application itself. And by definition, by doing that, we are actually reducing the blast radius, right? So if there was a compromise or something, we don't want it to trickle beyond the scope that we've given it. And the other action aspects is, service accounts are resources, right? Just like any other resources within Google Cloud. So imagine a resource like, let's say, a virtual machine was compromised inside Google Cloud, right? You could do a lot of damage there, right? So same thing with service accounts, right? If a service account is compromised, then you can use the service account to do malicious things within Google Cloud. So you have to protect it from compromise, just like you would do any other resource within Google Cloud, right? And again, going back to our theme here, reducing the blast radius, right? We want to make sure that if something was to happen, we're limiting the scope, the area in which the actual incident happened. So again, the reducing blast radius is a common theme between the two elements of principal and resources of the dual service here. Now, a very important question here is, and this is what really, where we arrive from the beginning here, is that when should I use service accounts, right? And really for applications that run by themselves, right? That's when you're using service accounts, which is completely opposite to a user account is, right? So when we're running applications that run by themselves, remember we talked about batch processes, agents, etc., right? It actually provides an identity, right? It is a non-user, right? Typically in the form of applications, and that's something that runs with no human involvement. These are the characteristics of something that is considered an application that is running by themselves, right? So that's the first bit, right? When should I use a service account, right? Now, also a different scenario is for applications that requires a user authentication, right? And notice I use the word auth-n, right? And that's an abbreviated way of actually writing authentication, right? So I use that quite a lot in the slide and in general in my course deck, right? So really what I mean by the second bullet point is, again, some kind of authentication scheme that may possibly be custom, right? We then actually have access to a GCP resources indirectly, right? So the app actually confirms the authentication and the authorization, and then uses the service account to authenticate directly indirectly to the GCP services, right? And that then gives them access to the GCP resources. So this is kind of like a chain of events here, right? Where an application is requesting something on behalf of a user, right? And is accessing the resource, but you have to authenticate and authorize with the resource, which then gives you access to the end uh, resource itself, right? So it's like a multi-level access there, right? Now, how do you choose service account used? We kind of like look at um, why you should use it. So let's now look at how you would use this. And this is a great little bit of a flow chart from the Google website, and I put a link at the bottom. So let's start at the top, right? So first of all, this is the most basic question is, are we running in Google Cloud? Remember I told you that users can exist outside of Google Cloud, right? And we seek those users, but with service accounts, they actually have to be in Google Cloud. So if we are running in Google Cloud, right, the next question is are we running some kind of automated application or something? And in this example, it's looking at the Google Kubernetes cluster, right? Now, if we're not running into Google Kubernetes cluster, then we can attach a service account, right? But if we're running a Google Cloud Kubernetes environment, then we would use workload identity, right? So just kind of like a separation of two different use cases. Now, in the event that we're not running on Google Cloud, right, then we obviously would be using an external identity provider, and is if one supported. If one is supported, then we would just naturally use identity federation, which basically means something like Active Directory on-prem or something like that, to sync the users across into cloud identity within Google Cloud, right? Now, if we're not using an external IDP, right, then we would have to create a service account key, right? Just a different mechanism, um, but can be also be done. And that kind of concludes today's module. Thank you.